Welcome to our first of our sort of rebranded, redone Christians in GIS webinars. I'm Juliana McMillan-Wilhoit, part of sort of the steering committee or whatever we call ourselves, sort of the force behind Christians in GIS. And so Christians in GIS is, as the name suggests, we are a group of faithful Christians, people who hold to the Nicene Creed, so people who believe in how can we leverage geospatial technology to create a world that is better? So we do that in all sorts of different ways. Some people work directly in missional roles. That is originally how we came together. But there are people like me who I'm just sort of living out my life as a faithful Christian, leveraging geospatial technology to help the world and through doing my daily work. And so we have a listserv, which if you are not a part of, you'll get added to by like registering for this webinar. But we're now starting to do these monthly webinars or on some frequency to try and have a place for us to come together. So today, Ken Howard, who is with the FaithX Project, is going to be presenting on his work and on the work that they've done. I'm really, really excited about that to look and talk about structural racism within the context of geospatial technology. So just a few housekeeping things. We're going to ask that you just turn your videos off so that we have friends from all over the world who are here, so we can just reduce the bandwidth that's needed for this conversation. We also are recording this conversation just so that this can be a resource for other people who may not be able to make our conversation today, and it'll get posted to our website and to some other places. We're also going to be leveraging the Q&A tool. So if you go to the top of the screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. And so if you have questions, if you can type them in there, that's just a place for us to be able to keep track of Q&A. If you can't find that, you can also just type them in the chat. But we'll try and have, Ken present, then we can have more of a discussion afterwards. But again, we are super thankful that you are all here and that we have this opportunity to come together in this season of Advent as brothers and sisters in Christ to be able to learn more about geospatial technology. And one of the ways that our brothers in Christ is doing that. So anyway, Ken, I will give the floor over to you.
All right.
Quick question before we get started. Juliana, and I'm sorry to cut in. Can you hey, there you go, maximize it. Thanks.
So before I start, let me just ask you all to just ignore the thing that at the top of the screen that says bad request invalid URL. I haven't figured out how to get rid of it, but I'm glad to be here. Kind of excited that you asked me to be part of this this reborn webinar today, looking at what we've been doing at FaithX in mapping and mitigating systemic racism or structural racism, as it can be also called. So let me just do a little bit by way of introduction. By the way, I'm using Esri technology in all of this. This is a this is a map story, and I'm using other GIS technology to develop the maps that you'll see in here. And so anyway, it's something that we can all learn from. So just an introduction. My name is Ken Howard. I'm an ordained faith leader in the Episcopal Church. I'm a two-time church planter. And after my last church plant, I was faced with the question of what do I do next? Do I start another church? Which would mean like training yet another bishop, because few of the people in top leadership in the church know much about church planting. Or do I take what I've learned in terms of planting churches, which means knowing your community and having good data on it, and take that to the church as a whole. And so I founded the FaithX Project in 2016. It's a 501c3 nonprofit faith-based consulting, research, and redevelopment practice. So today's agenda, what we're going to be covering in today's webinar, and this is, by the way, adapted from a webinar, first webinar we ever did to expose people to mapping and mitigating systemic racism. So today's agenda, introductions and overview, obviously, which we're winding up now. We're going to talk about what is systemic racism, mapping systemic racism, engaging systemic racism, and then have some time for discussion and Q&A. So, when we launched FaithX almost 6 years ago now, we discerned our mission to be helping congregations survive and thrive in challenging times. Yes, that was our pre-COVID vision statement. So little did we know how prophetic those words would be or how soon. We had the pandemic, had an economic collapse. We had societal upheaval, which erupted in response to a murder of an unarmed black man by a policeman, and to the systemic or structural racism that it represented. So, what is systemic racism? And this is important in terms of looking at individual, organizational, and cultural behavior change. Is that we don't want to be accusing people of racism to get at the issue of systemic racism. That doesn't mean that everybody is racist. But it does mean that when a social system is structured in such a way as to systemically disadvantage one particular race or ethnic group to the advantage of another. So in this case, we're talking about disadvantaging black people and other minorities to the advantage of white people, which means that you don't have to be racist to be complicit in systemic racism, if you look at it that way. So, as I was discussing with the leaders before everybody got on, systemic racism was not something that FaithX originally set out to do. But what we found, just almost stumbling into it, is that in the work that we were doing, helping congregations learn about and engage their neighborhoods, we could see the effects of systemic racism over and over and over again, and far too often to be a coincidence. As a matter of fact, we had our research director calculate the likelihood that just 12 of the issues that we deal with in here could have happened by chance is about 8 billion to 1. So using a case study to take a look at this today, and the case study is with St. Paul's Episcopal Church in the village of Flatbush, Brooklyn, New York. And just to give a tip of the hat, all the maps that we've used in this presentation were created using MapDash for Faith Communities, which is an app that was developed by Datastory with our help. So let's start with redlining. This is where a lot of this started. So in 1933, Congress established what's called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC. In theory, its purpose was to promote urban renewal by designating areas in which housing loans could support redevelopment, ostensibly rating them by risk level. I say ostensibly because it didn't turn out that way. So if you look at this map, you see one of the original red line maps of in this case, Brooklyn, right here. And here's the congregation that we're dealing with right here. So what they did was the ratings were green meant best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant declining, and red made meant hazardous. So they were A, B, C, and D, green, red, yellow, and blue. But in practice, it became a real insidious form of housing and economic discrimination. So what you had was people being moved into different areas, kind of subtly and not so subtly pushed into different areas. Higher income whites ended up being directed towards green and blue areas. Lower income whites ended up being pushed towards the yellow areas, and blacks and other minorities ended up in the red areas. And so just to take a look at this, this is using the slide function of story maps. Here's the red line. Now, if you cover that over with this, you see that this area here is African American. Lines up almost perfectly with the red areas. And you can also see that it also hits some of the areas that are of excuse me, sorry, of Hispanic and Latino. And then, that's how it started. And actually, not all of Long Island was red line, but it might as well have been, because both officially and unofficially, this trend of pushing people by race and ethnicity into different areas was happening across the board. So, but even though this happened, it began in 1930s and the Fair Housing Act got rid of it, made it illegal to do in the 1960s. Its impact still lives on in today. So we're just looking at several maps that you can see this. So on the left, it'll always be the race and ethnicity, and on the right will be the particular issue we're looking at. So here we have food deserts, and now food deserts, as you probably know, is defined as poverty and low access to nutritious food. So again, there's the race and ethnicity, and you'll notice that all of the red areas, the food deserts, end up in African American and minority areas. Health effects. Obesity is one issue that is very big in this area, very prevalent in this area. And so there's your African American area and your Latino areas. Here is the prevalence of obesity. High blood pressure. Same thing. Here's where all the high blood pressure shows up in the African American area, and to some degree in the areas where Latinos are. Coronary heart disease. Same thing. See right here, it's still higher in this particular area. Now, just think about that for a minute. Think about coronary heart disease and other heart disease as an issue. And now look at the next one. Where do the cardiologists live? Okay, so, or where they work. So here is where the coronary heart issues are, in the African American and Latino areas. And let's see where the cardiologists work. Okay, here's the congregation right in the midst of the African American area, and the cardiologists are all along the shore in the mostly white areas. COVID vulnerability, same thing. So here's the race and ethnicity. Here's the incidence of COVID vulnerability. And let's look at medical insurance. Same thing. Black low potential for health insurance in the areas that we've been looking at. Rent burden. Rent burden is defined as paying 50% or more of your income on rent. And there you see it again. If you look at workforce by class, orange being service class, the lowest paid, those tend to end up in the same areas again. And disposable income, same thing. The lower income families are in those same areas of race and ethnicity in the African American and Latino areas. Public education spending. And here's where you begin to really see the structural effects, is that the public education, here we go, I have to go back. So here we go. So you have the same issue. You see the lowest areas of public education spending by, by the state and county government in those same areas again. Households with internet access. Now that we're talking about education, we see the same thing here. That to make headway in your educational attainment, you have to have internet access these days. And there you go again. And you see that bearing itself out in educational attainment. That in the African American and Latino areas, it's mostly high school graduate only or some college. Crime rate. And one of the things that we've learned is that systemic or structural racism actually makes its way into the data we collect and how we label the data. Because what we found in looking deeper into the issue of crime rate, it actually is not the actual incidence of crime, it's the incidence of arrest. And so, here you see African American neighborhoods having a much, much higher incidence of arrest. And as one of the people we were talking to in Long Island said, it's not like there aren't white people doing crime. It's just there are fewer white people being caught doing crime. And here's one that was really chilling. That is police killings by police. So there are the areas again. But look at where all of the killings by police of residents of these areas happen. It's very, very highly overrepresented in the African American and Latino areas. And the interesting thing is if you look at these things, they're mostly black people, African Americans, that are being killed. However, some of them are whites being killed, and white people are more likely to be killed in an African American neighborhood by police than they are in a white neighborhood. So how do we engage systemic racism? So one of the things that we've found is in all the work that we've done, but especially in this area, is that you can give people all the data that you want about a particular issue, and they will not change their behavior based on data alone. Why is that? It's because that people don't take on board the kind of data and information that you're presenting to them. They don't give it credence. They don't trust it because they don't see the meaning in it. And by seeing the meaning in it, people need, the way that human beings ascribe meanings to things is through story. So data is never going to change people's minds. But if you can put put that data into a story using a trusted medium like maps, you begin to help people find their place in the data and what it means to them and to their neighborhoods and to the African American church down the street. Um, uh, so that one of the things that we found is that what actually the way that systemic racism comes to being in the first place is through a narrative. The narrative that's kind of us versus them. It's very easy for people to think that if something's going wrong, it's not our fault. It's got to be somebody else's fault, and it's easy to focus in on the people that are different. Sometimes even to the detriment of your own community. There's a book that's called, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. I can put it, I can send it to you all later, but it basically is a book which talks about how people respond to issues of race, and it used on the front of the book is a picture of a pool, and it talks about, for example, how some communities actually cemented in their pool rather than opening it up to non-whites, thereby also removing their own access to that kind of recreation. And so, part of what we're trying to do here by showing this kind of information is to show them that narrative is false, but also to begin to create a different narrative that is true and is more of a it's all us narrative that can be strong enough and clear enough and localized enough that it can begin to displace the narrative, the false narrative of systemic racism in your areas. So how do we begin to do that? Well, we start by reviewing what we call a neighborhood insights report. This is something that FaithX developed again with Datastory, and what we do is we drop a pin in an area, and we look at a 5-minute drive time and a 15-minute drive time, and kind of use a cookie cutter to cut through about 40 different relevant church/community relevant issues that then can be displayed in infographic form. Why 5 and 15? 5-minute is considered it's 5-minute is kind of a rough equivalent of what can be called trade webs, or we call them mission webs, but they're the area that the congregation is most responsible for and has the most influence over. So we call that the ministry area for a congregation. 15 minutes, data shows, or the research shows that no matter where you are, whether it's suburban, urban, or rural, 75% of a congregation will come from within 15 minutes. It's surprising to find that out, but it's true. So what we begin to do is to look with them in terms of what are the issues there. So we see that that household income is low, disposable income is low. We look at houses in poverty, which is about 50% higher than the national average. Houses receiving food stamps, twice the national average. Overabundance of people in the service industry. The home value is much higher than the national average, which means that with the lower income, it becomes harder to find housing. So, and then the other thing we see is here's the amount, the percent of income spent on mortgage in the area, which is 56.7% compared to the national average, which is about 16. And we also see over here that 84% of the housing units are, excuse me, are rentals, renter occupied. And when you begin to look at those two things, along with rent burden, you begin to see that what you have taking place here is homelessness. It is a vulnerability to homelessness, because the more you have to pay of your income for rent or mortgage, and the more people that are in rentals, the higher the likelihood that they can be pushed out onto the street. We also found that medical coverage in this area is really low. People don't have a chance to exercise, which tends to lead to those kind of issues that we were talking about in terms of heart disease, obesity, cardiac problems, etc. So, how do we engage the community in this, in changing the kind of narrative that has developed in their area to one that is not an us-them narrative that's racially based, to one that is an all-us narrative. So what we do is we walk people through a series of 6 questions. So the first is, what are the greatest challenges facing our community? And we get very specific about this, and that's part of the deal. Why this is so effective to do it this way is that they begin to see it not as this overwhelming national problem that they can't do anything about, to a problem that is localized in their neighborhood in specific ways that they can actually do something about. So the next step is, what are the root causes? What are the current impacts? And what might address the root causes and current impacts? And then look at their own congregation and their community and the organizations that they work with, to say, what are the strengths and the resources and gifts that can be brought to bear from our congregation, from our community, from other congregations and organizations. And then, of course, an essential step is then to ask, okay, God doesn't call us to be social workers per se. We're not here to solve every problem. What is God calling us as our congregation to respond to? What do our strengths and weaknesses as a congregation say to us when we take that and compare it to the issues in the community? How is God speaking through that data to us about what God is calling us to actually respond to? And that might not be doing something themselves. It could be catalyzing something to happen. It could be reaching out to lots of other organizations that have strengths in their areas of weakness, in which they can come together and together engage the issues that they're finding. And then finally, what is our first step? Because in all problems like this, people can basically figure out what needs to be done. It's a problem of breaking it down into achievable bits. And of course, the first one is, what is the first step? How do we begin to engage this problem? So I actually went through this faster than usual. So I am going to close this up temporarily and see what questions that people have.
Oh, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Yeah, it definitely gave me a lot of things to begin to think about. And so, yeah, I'd invite people to turn your video off, ask a question. We don't necessarily have to utilize the chat function, but would love to, have a dialogue. And again, this is being recorded. I don't think that's going to be a problem for anyone, but just want that to be clear.
Just a question of clarification. Thanks, Ken, for presenting. That was awesome. There's a lot there to digest, as Juliana is saying. But for clarification, when you said 5-minute and 15-minute, I was assuming that was drive time, but I wasn't 100% sure of that.
Yes, that is drive time. There are a lot of different tools that present the data in different ways, like by a radius in miles, or by zip codes, or by some kind of a constructed area. But what we've found is that, based on the research that we've seen, those don't really make much, don't have a real correlation to what's going on, especially when it happens to be a church. So that's why we chose drive times, 15-minute drive time, 5-minute drive time.
So as someone, oh, Michael, you can go.
That's all right, Juliana. You sounded like you were headed down a path there, and I'll just go after you. How's that?
Okay. So I'm someone who's really passionate about leveraging the local church to be able to understand their communities and to be able, to live within the context in which we live. So I'm curious twofold. So first of all, are you primarily working with urban churches, or do you ever work with suburban churches? Because there's a very, I'd say that at least the North American church, we tend to have a really good theology of the urban areas, and we don't have as good of one about the suburban area. Just look at the number of books and sort of Tim Keller and the mission of the city. So I guess that's my first question, is sort of can we talk a little bit more about the context in which you're working?
Well, the interesting thing is this, this correlation that we've talked about in terms of drive time, and the 5-minute drive time for the ministry area and the 15-minute drive time for the membership area tends to be the same no matter where you are. It's what happens in it's like 70% of people that come to a church will always come from within 15 minutes. It's what happens in the other 30, the other 30 minutes that makes a difference in urban versus suburban versus rural. But we've actually done this kind of work with systemic racism in both urban, suburban, and rural areas. And we find similar things in Catonsville, Maryland area. We found that it was all suburban area, and you find that you'll see Route 40 going through kind of diagonally through the area, and on one side, the lower side of that, the southern side of that, it's entirely white, and on the upper side of that, it's entirely African American and Latino. And that's a suburb. Other places in Long Island, it was the same way. In one suburb area of Long Island, there was you could actually see from a satellite view where the white area was and where the African American and Latino area was. Not because you can actually see African Americans and and white people, from that area. It's just looking at size of house, the tree cover, the number and type of businesses, even the width of the streets, and it was so amazing because it ran down between the backyard, between a row of houses, all the way down, and it was the dividing line was in the backyard between two houses. It'd be almost all white on one side, almost all African American on the other side. It's a little bit different when we go into rural areas. In the area that we were particularly looking at, it was looking at racial issues between the in the Midwest, and it was largely between issues between the white population and the Native American population. You were seeing more missing persons among the Native American populations, more human trafficking. A lot of the disease issues were there. Food desert issues were there. So, and it's still the same process. People got to stop seeing each other as different, and people need to see how it's affecting them in their area, and how doing something to impact the systemic racism issues will benefit everybody. I know. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. It does. So, Michael, I think you were going to ask a question or some. Well, yeah, I'm not sure who has the next question. So, or Jerry, you just came off on video, so maybe you have a question.
Well, I was going to type the question, but why don't I just say it? And that is, Ken, it's great to hear you present on this again. Glad that we've had a chance to meet sometimes in person. It's always stimulating. I would welcome an example of how a church has effectively engaged with systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
So you've given us areas where we could, right, showing the needs and stuff.
Well, in that particular area, they actually just went back and they looked at the problems that they were uncovering, and so they were looking at areas like looking at issues of crime, of heart disease, obesity, and stuff because of lack of exercise, and the lack of exercise was probably because of crime. That they couldn't go to a gym, they couldn't walk around their neighborhood. There were issues of getting some of the obesity and health issues were due to the inability to get good food, nutritious food within a mile of their homes. And so they looked at all that, and they came up with several responses. One is they began to offer exercise classes at the church. Yoga in the sanctuary, so that people could come in and exercise. They worked at some community policing issues, because of the issues of the high incidence of killings of African Americans by police, and they started working on programs in which they could bring police and community members together. That was a particular area in which they were also banding together with other churches. This was a predominantly white congregation in an area that was somewhat African American, and so they banded up with another a majority African American congregation, and some other that another African American Episcopal congregation, and some other nearby churches that were of other denominations, and banded together to bring the community together. So part of what was happening was it's people are dealing, police come into an area like that, and they're kind of subconsciously they're subconsciously primed to think of that area as dangerous. So they're more likely to see a need to defend themselves with lethal force in that area. But that's because, in large part, because they don't have personal relationships with people in that area, because you don't see it, you people you don't know seem more threatening to you than people that you do. So they did that, and not just those things where they were actually doing stuff together, but they were also doing some advocacy work. They were also looking at actually more effectively using their own property to deal with some of the issues, because they had a fair amount of property. And they began to do stuff like build affordable housing on the land that they had, and some of the other churches that they had, to deal with that issue of homelessness. They also one of the things that they found is that because of the high excuse me, the high cost of housing and land in that area, most of the nonprofit service organizations that would normally be helping that community, they couldn't afford to live there either. And so they would offer to either use some of their space that wasn't being used, the 80% of their building that wasn't being used the other 6 days of the week, and bring in people like what's the word I'm looking for, about a remote office for the local public health department, job training, because that was an issue, and other things like that. So and part of it too was actually actually overcoming their own biases by seeing and engaging with the data. One of those congregations, when I told them that they had a 25% Latino population within their 15-minute drive time, the person, the rector, the pastor of the congregation said, "No way." And so I asked, why are you saying no way? He says, because there are no bodegas. And if you know anything about Latino populations, you know that they're extremely diverse. That that bodegas tend to be more associated with the Caribbean population, but not the African American. Excuse me, but not the Mexican or Central American population that come to the country, and so he was actually kind of showing his bias there. And I took him, got him in the car, and drove around, and we actually found 2 bodegas and a number of Latino markets and other institutions. And so it's like, how come he didn't see that they were there? Well, he doesn't travel in that area. They go to different, he goes to different stores than they do, etc. So it's not that he's racist, it's just that he's blind to issues of the impact of race. So that's an example of what we what we did with congregations and what they did in response. Mark. Mark has his hand up. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Ken. Thank you for your presentation. I think you've made a compelling case for the data story or the story map in the use of GIS with the demographic information. I think that demographic information really does tell an important story and a bias. My question to you is, with all of that, what impacts have you seen on local churches or ministries by using these MapDash GIS tools with the FaithX Project?
Could you rephrase that for me? I'm not quite getting what you're looking for.
Sure. I guess with the use for what you showed in the webinar with the demographics and the tools, what impacts have you seen on local churches or ministries that you've worked with the FaithX Project? Kind of what's the so what? What has been that impact that you've seen in doing this?
Well, the so what, I mean, there's several so whats. One of the things that I think of as a so what that happens just about every time we do this, whether it be for systemic racism or whether just studying their area in general and looking at things like, I don't know, generational predominance. There will always be what I call a holy crap moment. I mean, literally in one place, we were actually looking at generational predominance. And the senior warden, who's like the head of the church board, looked at the map that we were projecting and said, holy crap, what is that big sea of red across the street from the church? And he said, is it what I think it is? And I said, well, just read the legend. You want them to do the work. Read the legend. He says, millennials? Holy crap. He said, click on that so we can find out how many there are. Then he said, holy crap, again. He said, holy crap, 1,000 millennials. Why don't we see them? And you see, I didn't even have to ask that question. It drives, the seeing data that they were blind to makes a huge impact on people. And in understanding their own biases and shifting their own biases. In this particular congregation, we also showed them that they had a 25%, roughly 25% Latino population in their area. And it was the same thing with that. They just didn't know they were there. And so they realized from that experience, just by looking at it, they realized their own blind spots. And they realized that if they were going to engage those people, they had to change. They were going to have to go to those areas. They were going to have to find out what people in those areas want. And need, and what kind of worship they're comfortable with, what kind of skills they bring, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting thing about that is, I got an email from the senior pastor at that particular congregation later in the day. I was only there for part of their strategic planning, annual planning process, and she wrote back and she said, I just want to tell you two things. One is, when you came in, we thought we knew what you were going to tell us. We had no idea. And two, we worked on our outreach plan the night before. After you left, we tore it up and started over.
Wow.
And
That's
that is
great,
really,
Ken. Those are great examples. Thank you.
Yeah, because it's really an issue of behavior change, and because you can't keep, as Einstein said, you can't keep doing the same thing and expecting a different response unless you're just crazy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a sort of related question to what Mark brought, but maybe from a different angle.
Sure.
So obviously, as GIS professionals, we like to think that we can be data driven by many of our decisions. And really, I think that's a focus for many of us, that we want to present good data, and hopefully decisions will be made based on the data that we're presenting. But I find it kind of interesting, even in our organization, that there's always this dichotomy of wanting to be led by the Spirit of God, and then, you know, maybe using data to infer some of that stuff, but maybe not. You know, it's like sometimes it's not even a data-driven decision. It becomes what is couched as a Spirit-led decision. And have you encountered that in your dealings with, you know, churches and organizations, or is that something that you just don't see once the data is presented, that people go, oh, well, the data, I like what you said. You said, how is God speaking through the data? I think that's really a great way to say it. But do you run into that kind of dichotomy sometimes?
Oh yeah, all the time. You know, so and part of it is language. We found that when we used the term data driven, we didn't get very far. We got a lot more resistance, and so we started using the term data grounded, and got a lot better response, and it allowed us to say to the people, we're we're not setting up data as an alternative to prayerful and intuitive discernment. What we're just saying is that discernment, that kind of discernment, is only part of the discernment. God speaks to you through prayer, but God also speaks to you through data and through what you see in the world around you. And God calls us. One of the Episcopal liturgies says, God, open our eyes to see your hand at work in the world around us. And so what we're saying is that we are asking you to let the neighborhoods that you're in teach you, let God speak to you through that about what God is calling you to do. We also have a congregational vitality instrument that we use. So they can look at their vitality strengths and weaknesses and kind of see which they can leverage. But the important thing is that we're not setting this up as an alternative or saying anything negative about intuition. Intuition is a valid, is the way God speaks, and it's a valid way of knowing. But so is data, and it's just crucially important. And I also, I'm not afraid of using the scriptures. I said, well, Jesus said, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And we're just showing you some truth here. Said that somebody, I think, left out the final phrase that Jesus said. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But it may really piss you off first, or make you uncomfortable. And so, when God speaks to us, it's not always in comfort, but it's to give us a sense of holy discomfort, with the world as it is around us, and a discomfort with our level of engagement in the world about us. I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you. That really that's a great synopsis. And I took some notes here, so I have to say I might have to plagiarize some of this from you if that's okay. So using the right language, and how is God speaking through the data? I really like that phrase, so I think I'm going to use that.
Yeah, and by the way, we also we were very intentional in terms of stop using trade webs as a name, for the areas of influence of congregations, and we started calling them mission webs. Because people don't like to. People in churches don't like to think of themselves as businesses, and yet there's so much things that businesses are doing to learn about their communities that the church really needs to know about.
So if I can jump in a little, I will turn
Yeah.
my camera. So I'm from Europe, so this is really disturbing me seeing myself very large on a big screen. So let's see if I can turn it off. Yes. Okay. So what I thank you very much for your intriguing webinar, and I really like your examples and also your methods about how you could apply GIS. I see it maybe mostly as a diagnosis tool to get a better understanding of your surrounding. And I also really liked what you said. Well, God can speak to the data, but we might not like what we see. And that reminded me of Luther, who said, "Verbum Dei adversarius noster," which is God's word as our what's English counterpart, so our adversary. So God's word can be our adversary because we don't like to hear what God is sometimes shouting at us, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, but one question from my part is, I'm not sure, but I tend to see sometimes the American society more segregated than the, well, in my case, the Dutch society. But would your method also work for Dutch society to help churches better understand their context?
Yeah. Having gone through seminary, I learned something about all the wars that different parts of the church fought against each other. And I also have I was raised Jewish, and any time that the Christians were warring with each other, the Jews were always caught in the middle. And so I think that some of the issue tends to be a more faith-based issue in terms of differences of faith and fear of faiths. I'm thinking, Islam, and people projecting onto the unknown of Islam their fears, and then. In addition to increasing the likely discrimination against them, it's also begins to force a separation. As people, white flight starts to begin, because people are naturally going to move together, especially if they're from a population that's immigrant. They're going to begin to gather in a particular area so they can be together, and then you'll see the white flight begin, where people end up moving out of those predominantly inner city areas, out into the suburbs. So so I think it's different, perhaps not quite as racial, as faith-based and class-based. I know that in parts of the world like Central America and South America, it's not race-based primarily, but class-based and wealth-based. There's people think of people are very creative at finding ways to divide. The church is better at division than it is at multiplication. It always has been.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ken, for taking the time today to present to us and Yeah, and just for everyone for coming and being part of our presentation today. So we are going to wrap it up because we've hit the 1 hour mark. But I am just very grateful for all of you in the ways that you are trying to understand what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus, and the ways that you are working on living that out. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I think you probably got like an email invite or something from my email address, juliana@tabulaspatial.com. But we'll try and send just some follow-up information. And there's also in the chat, someone put a link to an article that Ken wrote as well, which is also a great overview to this information. So anyway, this will also be posted on our YouTube channel later today. So if you think this conversation would be useful to other people, some of that language about discerning through the data, feel free to share that on our YouTube channel. Is Christians in GIS. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And Ken, thank you so much for your ministry work and what you are doing. All right. Blessings to everyone.
Back at you.